And we're coming up to 21 minutes after 12 o'clock. Well, here's a problem that's not good for a call-in show like Maritime Noon. It turns out a lot of people are not comfortable talking on the phone. A recent study by the polling company Research Co. surveyed Canadians and found that half reported feeling anxious about calling a stranger. That's an even higher proportion than reported feeling anxious about public speaking. And it's not unique to outgoing calls. A 2019 survey of office workers in the UK found that 62% of workers reported feeling at least somewhat anxious about answering the phone. With texting, email, and video calls, it's easier than ever to avoid picking up the phone, but phone calls are still important, and not just for this show, but for making doctor's appointments and maintaining friendships, not to mention a whole host of other situations where a phone call can resolve issues quickly. So today we are asking, how do you feel about making phone calls? If you're phone phobic, why? And with so many ways to avoid calling, do you think there's still a benefit to picking up the phone? Well, we certainly hope you pick one up today and give us a call. Our number is 1-800-565-1940. And for those who don't like talking on the phone, our email is marnoon@cbc.ca. My guest today is Mary Jane Copps, who is an author and facilitator who goes by the moniker The Phone Lady. And she joins us here in the studio. Thanks for coming in.
Thanks for having me, Bob. Glad to be here.
So if you believe the studies, phone phobia, at least to some degree, is quite prevalent. Do you think it's grown over the years?
It definitely has. So I've been the phone lady now for 17 years. And I think maybe 2 or 8% of my business was around coaching people with phone phobia and anxiety. And now it is about 40% of the work that I do and has been growing really since the pandemic. Since 2020, I've seen a real spike in that area.
So the pandemic would be one reason why we're seeing this growth, but I suspect probably not the only.
No, it wouldn't be the only reason. I think during the pandemic, when we all embraced video calling, that probably contributed to the spike that I'm seeing. But, what I like to say is that the BlackBerry became the Crackberry in the mid-90s, and we've been moving towards increased text communication since that time. And so you have a lot of options. If you don't feel comfortable talking on the phone, you've got lots of other ways to communicate with people.
And people seemingly are diverting to those ways then, and making things work, I suppose, to some degree.
Absolutely.
But what do you miss when you don't pick up the phone?
Well, the main thing you miss is the power of the tone of voice. So people will say to me, well, yes, Mary Jane, but there's tone of voice on a video call. There is. It can be distorted, and there's a lot of other distractions on a video call.
What's going on in the background,
exactly.
For example?
What's on their bookcase?
Yeah.
Are they reading that book too? That kind of thing. And also, we get more tired on screen than we do talking on the phone. So our eyes get tired and so on in front of that computer screen. And, we had a storm recently here in Halifax, and many of us didn't have internet or any of those things, but we had our phones charged. So the ability to phone family members and friends and see how they were doing, or even if you're alone and you want the comfort of having a friend on the phone during the storm, you have that ability.
So are you saying it's more likely that active listening would be taking place on a telephone call as opposed to video conferencing?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I've always loved about working on the phone is that our hearing is amplified, much the same as being blind, because it's the only sense that we're using. So the ability to communicate with clarity on the phone is amazing when you're using those skills.
And yet, people, obviously, if you, again, believe these studies, talk about having phone phobia, and that's real.
It is real.
That comes with a whole list of symptoms. What are some of the symptoms that people feel?
The same symptoms you have felt when you have been anxious about something: sweaty palms, heart palpitations, feeling faint, procrastinating on other tasks so that you can avoid the task in front of you, one of the young women I worked with, the reason that I had the opportunity to work with was that she broke down in tears with her supervisor and said, I'm going to have to go to my doctor and get some medication in order to do this job.
So this is a workplace issue.
Yes.
Then. I'm thinking if you're at a call center, you'd be at a real disadvantage. I suppose maybe you wouldn't even take the job if you were feeling that way.
That's
but
right.
There would be all kinds of other workplace settings where this would also likely become an issue, and maybe it's becoming more of an issue if what's happened in the last 5 years is playing out.
Well, that's right. So my clients are all business in some way, and as younger workers come in and they don't have the skill set, then training is needed to give them the skill set. And one thing we might want to acknowledge is that I certainly grew up with a house phone. And as a consequence, by the time I was 3, I was taught how to answer that phone and say, my mother will be with you in a minute, or whatever it was. And everywhere we went, doctor, wherever we went, people talked on the phone. So we had that skill. We weren't taught it, but we had it. And once house phones started to disappear and the phone ended up in our hands, then it was our choice as to whether we would develop those phone skills or not. So that's also part of its technology has brought us here, and we've all embraced the technology.
So this is not just the younger generation that we're talking about here that are experiencing this. This covers the gamut.
It does. You have a choice. Maybe you're more introverted and you have the choice at work to text or email. Then you will. And you'll stop picking up that phone and you'll stop making those calls. So I certainly have individuals in my generation that no longer appreciate it when I phone. In fact, my sister just learned how to text. She's about 10 years older than I am. And she texts me all the time, and then she gets annoyed when I phone her.
Right. But for those people who feel anxiety about a phone call, is it starting the phone call? Is it keeping it going? Is it how to wrap it up?
It's all of those things. So the most common thing on an inbound call is, I don't know why they're calling, so I want them to leave me a message so I can prepare. And if I can answer their question by emailing them, then I will. On an outbound call, yes, it's, are they going to answer, first of all, or am I going to have to leave a voicemail? And then what do I do to get the conversation started? And how do I keep that conversation going? And what if they're a constant talker? How do I end the call? All those things.
So you work with people who are feeling these things, then how do you help them get past those feelings?
The first thing is to talk about some of the reasons behind how they might feel. So to give you an example, with one young woman that I was working with, she had come from a very chaotic household, and she really liked to be in control of everything that happened during the day. And so that's where phone calls gave her a lot of stress. So I taught her how to create an agenda for a phone call. So as someone calls in or you're calling out, you can start the conversation by saying, Bob, today there's 3 things that we want to address, so that the call has a bit of a structure that you can follow. Write some notes before you pick up the phone so that you're not having necessarily to improvise the whole conversation. And for some individuals, I'll say, this weekend, don't text. For 2 days, don't text. You can warn your friends that you're going to call them so that they'll answer, but don't text just for 48 hours. See how that goes. See what that feels like. And the feedback is interesting because they'll say, oh, well, we figured out what to do that evening a lot faster than if we'd been texting, or we caught up on a whole bunch of news that we never share by texting. So depending on their experience, they're going to say, oh, I see. This is why phone calls are useful. Because
texts can be vague, or they can be misinterpreted. I suppose there'd be less likelihood of that if you're speaking on the phone, because you would be able to quickly correct. You'd also, to your point, hear the tone, which would be very important, because how many times do you look at a text and say, ooh, that person's mad? And if you have a chance to kind of verify that down the road, you realize, oh yeah, no, they weren't mad at all. That's just their style of texting. Well,
that's right. And I think we've all gone back and forth with, can you do that at 2:00? No, I can't do it till 3. Well, what about 4:30 for me? That kind of back and forth and back and forth. So in a phone conversation, we can usually be more efficient.
All right. Well, we're asking, how do you feel about making phone calls with so many other ways to communicate? Do you tend to gravitate to those options? Or do you still prefer the efficiency of picking up the phone and discussing multiple issues potentially quickly and getting things settled? 1-800-565-1940 is the number, and our email is marnoon@cbc.ca. And we're hoping you can get in touch one way or the other. 1-800-565-1940 is the number. We're asking, how do you feel about making phone calls? Do you love it? Do you dread it? Of course, the irony of this conversation is that we are a phone-in show, so we're hoping you can get past any fears you have, at least for the time being. But if you're not able to give us a call at 1-800-565-1940, you can always send us an email, marnoon@cbc.ca. Maybe you have a story to share about a misunderstanding that took place, or something that was far more efficient or efficiently settled by phone versus the way things were going via email or text or some other form of communication. Our guest today is Mary Jane Copps. She is an author and a facilitator who goes by the moniker The Phone Lady. I'm sure you've got lots of stories.
I do have a great personal story. So I have been, like many people, clearing out my house, and I had someone in my world who was a tremendous hoarder. So I had a basement that was just pretty scary. And I had found down there an acetylene tank and something else. And I had put them in my car trunk, and I was going to take them to hazardous waste. And then I realized maybe I shouldn't be driving around with this stuff in the trunk of my car. So I phoned fire safety. This would not have happened by email. This is really important. So I spoke to an individual. He was very helpful. He said he'd come by and look at it. And then I said, well, because I have a really full basement, I said something about it. And he said, can I ask you a personal question? Was your husband a woodworker? And I said, yes. And he has a wood turner there. Yes, he does. So anyway, long story short, when he came to the house, he took a quarter of the stuff that was in the basement. And not only that, he priced a whole bunch of stuff for me to help me sell it on Facebook or whatever. Now, if I'd simply emailed fire safety and said, what do I do with an acetylene tank? They would have answered, and that would have been it.
Yeah.
And so that's the value of picking up the phone.
Yeah. Value-added phone call for sure. Okay, 1-800-565-1940. We are going to go to the phones right now. Joanne Lamy is on the line from Dartmouth. Hi, Joanne.
Hi, how are you?
Oh, I'm good. How are you? And how are you feeling about phone calls these days?
Well, a few weeks ago, I thought I'm going to start making phone calls now rather than texting and emailing, especially with certain people. So when I got a text from my daughter, I phoned her. And then I was thinking about a lifelong friend in Cape Breton, and the next day I phoned her. And then I was doing some political work, and I wanted some input from a person in Cape Breton, and I called her. And on every phone call, it was really good to... I think we were able to go more in depth on whatever we were talking about.
And it sounds like it was kind of a graduated approach to this return to phone calls, Joanne?
Yes, it was.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So just how much were you away from the phone then prior to that? I mean, were you? Was it a rarity that you would phone somebody on a particular day? Prior to that?
Well, I think like technology, and cell phones and texting and emailing and FaceTime and all of that became just sort of more the norm. I drifted away from phoning people, and the people that I normally would talk to on a regular basis, like my mother. She passed away, so that wasn't a phone call anymore. So I think, and I guess the other thing is that a lot of older people are not as adept at using all of the technology.
Absolutely.
And,
did the people that you called appreciate your call? I mean, were they as engaged in the conversation, and did they relax into it? Okay, that's great to hear.
Yes, yeah. And just one other little thing, I actually did I put in some time working in the Preston by-election, and I did some phone canvassing, and it was just like call after call after call, no answer, answering machine, call after call. And then when somebody finally would answer, it was wonderful to engage in a conversation.
Well, that speaks to something that is true about our society now, isn't it, Mary Jane? People don't pick up when you call. If you're phone canvassing, telemarketing, for so many people, especially with landlines now, you hear them say, the only reason I only have the landline because it's part of a package that I have that includes my cable and internet, and the landline came along with it. But the only people that ever called me on the landline are telemarketers, so I don't pick up. Yeah.
So that has definitely had a huge influence in our relationship with our personal calls, even on our cell phones too. When a certain numbers show up we don't know who they belong to, we tend to let it go to voicemail. We do have to be very, very careful of the criminal element that's come into our lives through telemarketing.
That's very true. And if there's no name displayed, or if the number is not familiar to me, I don't answer. If it's important, they will leave a message.
Yeah.
Agreed.
Okay, well, Joan, if you're back to phone canvassing, you're back in a big way on the phone. So it sounds like you're on your way.
Great.
Thanks for your story.
Okay, bye-bye.
1-800-565-1940 is the number to call, or you can send us an email at marnoon@cbc.ca. Don Penny is driving or in a car near in and around Halifax somewhere. Hi, Don.
Hi there.
Hi. What's your experience with their, relationship with the phone?
Well, I was brought up rural, born in the late 80s, and so, growing up with a landline, I became very familiar with a phone. And then when I moved to Halifax about 15 years ago, my first job was on a switchboard.
Wow.
When they used to exist with, people answering the phone. So it's very interesting. I feel more comfortable in the fact that I can hear the voice and understand, maybe where they're coming from based on their tone. But then sometimes I also struggle I think it makes me think of the meme where it's instead of call display, we need call reasoning, or the reason of the call before we pick up and feel comfortable talking. So, it's interesting to have both perspectives where I feel more comfortable on a phone call, but maybe people around my age or younger, that would not be the case. And so we do a lot more written communication, which is the bane of my existence, because it takes me so long to write out something, and then how am I saying it? How is it coming off? How are they going to perceive it? And then also, how am I going to perceive their response too? Takes way more time, I think.
It does. I mean, we are all pressured now to be good writers, and that wasn't necessarily a skill everybody needed 20 years ago.
It's a great skill to have.
It is.
But
when you're thinking about, one of the things that I think about a lot, and you mentioned, having that first job at a switchboard, I had one of those jobs too. The inability to communicate vocally is tricky in the job market, because there's still a ton of jobs that really need people to be able to have improvisational conversations. But I like the idea of having your screen show up why someone's calling. Maybe that's a technology you should investigate.
And then another interesting spin is I grew up in a household that was had deaf and hard of hearing members. So
oh yeah.
in addition to like, I don't know, I have like an interesting perspective on nonverbal communication, where a message can be sent through by not sign language, but just like body movements. And yeah, you're like sending a communication based on how you're moving your body or your hands.
Right.
And I've found that as an autistic person, I've found that invaluable in my life to help maybe understand like what some body movement may mean, or how someone may be feeling based on how their body is moving or hands are moving. But it's not universal, I suppose.
No, but I'm sure that our movement to screen conversations has helped with that.
Absolutely. Yeah, that was amazing that more people were into Zoom or FaceTime during the pandemic. That was a kind of a glimmer for me. I really enjoyed that.
Oh, great.
Interesting, yeah. That's an interesting perspective. Well, thanks for getting in touch, Dawn.
Yes, you're welcome. I'm looking forward to listening to what everyone else has to say.
All right. And indeed, we are getting some emails as well.
Oh, great.
Mary Jane, Amy got in touch from Hampton, New Brunswick, and says, between COVID and the loss of my 15-year-old son in 2021, I get a lot of anxiety when someone calls, to the point that I always let it go to voicemail. I become almost debilitated when I have to make a call. I'd be interested in hearing about the relationship between trauma and communication.
Wow. You have had some traumatic events there around the phone, and so how you're reacting and what you're doing, first of all, is perfectly okay. I mean, the reason that we have voicemail, which used to be a tape recorder attached to our phones, to use that to screen your calls, have never seen anything wrong with doing that. In terms of, is that somebody that you're able to talk to at this moment? Is this someone that you should talk to at all? Again, we've spoken briefly about the criminal element of telemarketing. So I think it's perfectly okay that you're letting the calls go to voicemail. I'm curious if it's a family member that's calling or a close friend, do you still feel that anxiety when you have to call them back? And if so, might you text them to let them know, I'm not comfortable talking on the phone this evening, but can we talk tomorrow morning? I mean, with all the channels of communication that we have, it's okay to combine channels to say, this is not a good time for me to talk to you, but can we talk on the weekend, for example?
Right, so really move into it gently and start obviously with friendly voices.
Yeah.
That, first of all, know you're calling, or that they are calling you.
Yes.
To sort of start that process.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, Amy, thanks for getting in touch. We're going to go back to the phones, and Alex is on the line from Dartmouth. Hi, Alex.
Hi, how you doing today?
Good. What's your relationship with the phone?
Well, I guess I would have some perspectives that are probably not too different from your last caller. I also was born in late 80s, so I'd be kind of on the beginning of that millennial cusp. And I have a couple of different perspectives on it. I do work in a role that requires me to work off of a work cell phone. There is a lot of incoming and outgoing calls via work, which I have absolutely no problem with as a method of communication. There is sometimes still a preference for me to like to rely on email, not because necessarily of an aversion to the conversation, but because it allows me a paper trail.
Yes.
For what I'm doing that is a little more concrete than maybe concentrating on, what was said or what wasn't said, and then what was claimed to have been said in a lot of those communications. With something like email or text, it's pretty concrete. It's right there. You can show it to people. You can duplicate it. And it's easy to follow. in my personal life, as I didn't get a cell phone until I was, I don't know, well into college, if not after, and initially found texting to be a very unusual way to communicate. I thought it was kind of slow and pointless. And like many other younger people, I have drifted away from personal communication via actual phone calls, because I think a lot of people in my age demographic and younger, the people that they are close to, people that they expect to hear from, people that they're in continuous communication, everyone communicates via this sort of back and forth text or email. There's a lot less calling. When there is calling, it oftentimes can be a sign of something emergent or something kind of critical. When it is not one of those people calling, again, being early in the millennial cusp, it probably means somebody's calling looking for money or to scam you or to put you through a survey. So numbers that you don't recognize, you're far more prone to just outright ignore. And if they don't leave a message, you're never going to answer it. You're never going to call them back. There may be a lot of instances where even if it is somebody you do know, I'm not in a position to take the phone call or to take or even want to take the phone call, whereas texting or something like that can kind of allow for a bit of an ongoing communication that you can dip in and out of, sort of as it's convenient to do so, to make it harder to close the loop. But it does allow you to maybe think a little bit more about your response.
Absolutely.
How you want to say what you want to say. I think that there is a lot of focus on, as we're talking about phone conversation, a lot of people say, well, a lot of what's conveyed is conveyed through voice tone. And I do think that as you come to be used to the way in which people communicate with you via text medium, there is also tone that can be quite clearly conveyed through that.
Through text,
a lot
Alex?
of older folks or yes.
Yeah,
yes,
capital letters is one way, right?
And emojis.
Yeah, you want to be angry, you type everything in caps, or maybe it just means it's your boomer dad or whatever who doesn't realize he's got his caps lock on. But you start to learn to read patterns in the way people communicate with you via text, or how they respond, or frequency of their responses, that works in a similar way to understanding voice tone, but I don't think is really looked at nearly as often when we're discussing these kinds of communication.
Yeah,
that's great, Alex.
Okay, thanks for the call, Alex. Do you want to respond to some of that?
Yeah, there's lots that you've raised there. So one of the things that is important is that we do need to combine channels. So you're absolutely right, Alex, especially in your work. You may want to have the phone conversation, but keeping all the notes. And then it's important that we use email to follow up or text to follow up. In fact, one of the impacts, streaming has had an impact on phone communication, believe it or not, because we now live in a world where we can, listen to Radio Noon tonight if we want to. We really feel that we have 100% control of our time. So an unexpected phone call is really not appreciated at all. And when you want to talk to somebody, it is important to either book that time, if it's in a business sense, get it in the calendar, or if it's your sister or your best friend, to say, can I call you later this afternoon? Are you available? So combining the mediums is really important. I think in addition to tone of voice, what we miss is having a back and forth in the moment. So when I get a text from my sister or my daughter and they ask, I want to respond, it's not the same as if we were on a phone call, because I could respond, but now they've moved on to do something else. So that conversation gets dropped, or it takes 3 days to finish. And much like Bob and I here, we are riffing off each other, if you will, and that's a difficult thing to do in text or even in email.
Yeah. Also interesting what Alex said about relating the phone to emergencies or the fear of being scammed.
Yes.
Of course, that would raise your anxiety.
Yes, absolutely. And I remember as a teenager, I had relatives that were very, very ill, and whenever the phone rang, you were sure you were about to get bad news. So certainly that is part of how we feel about calls today.
All right. Helen Fenton is on the line near Truro. Hi, Helen.
Hello.
Hi. How do you feel about the phone?
I love the phone. I wasn't brought up with a phone. We didn't have one in my house at all. I didn't have one till my early 20s after I got married. So, but I'm very comfortable with a phone. I love it. I'll never be without one. And I text also and do email. But I find texting takes so much time. Sometimes I'll be texting my friends, and they keep texting and texting. Finally, I just lay down the texting and call them. It's so much faster calling them and talking rather than writing everything out. Mm-hmm. And that works, most of the time. This is with closer friends. And, and another little thing that amazes me, my youngest grandchild is turning 12. So these children have not seen a phone, a desk phone, an old-fashioned desk phone with a dial.
Or one hanging on the wall in the house, yeah?
But I am talking about the ones that you pick up the receiver. It has a coil thing into the phone, and it has a dial on it. Because when they come here to visit, I have I did have an old Fisher-Price phone. Remember the old Fisher-Price toy phone?
I've made numerous calls on a Fisher-Price phone over the years.
Yeah, me too. And with the wheels and the eyes and stuff.
Yeah.
Anyway, you put that in front of a small child, 2 years old, a year old, whatever. They know to dial that and put the thing to their ear.
Wow.
And how, I have no idea. They just do it.
That's a great story. Thank you for that.
And they jabber into it,
Yeah.
I don't know how they know that. It doesn't look anything like a cell phone.
Something's intuitive then, I guess.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I guess so.
All right, thanks for the call, Helen.
My little story on the phone.
Love it. Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.
We are getting still emails as well here, and one is from Daphne who says, I'm one of those people that dread phone calls, mostly because I have hearing loss. Mm-hmm. Phone calls can be awkward and embarrassing when I constantly have to ask the other person to repeat themselves. The newer hearing aids use Bluetooth to feed the other person's voice directly into your ears. I got one a week ago. We'll see if it increases my comfort on the phone. That sounds like somebody who misses being able to communicate on the phone, knows the value of a communication or a conversation on the phone, and is trying to get back to that place.
Yes, thanks for that. I wasn't aware of the power of the new Bluetooth, so that's really valuable information to share with a lot of people. Okay,
Jason Squires on the line from Crapo on PEI. Hi, Jason.
Hi, how you doing?
Good. How do you feel about the phone?
I actually really like the phone. I have a small business that I run out of my shop right at my house there. Mm-hmm. And the majority of my advertising that I do is through Marketplace and internet and website and stuff. So my first line of contact from my customers is usually via an email or a text message or a messenger message. But then the nature of my work, I need very specific information from my client, who is usually looking for a quote or an estimate for my project. Mm-hmm. And I find trying to open up a verbal conversation with their clients is very difficult, and usually the clients are very reluctant to give up their phone number or to phone me to have a verbal conversation. So in my work, it's very important that I glean a certain amount of information to be able to provide the service that they're usually looking for. And usually they're looking for very specific quotes and stuff. And just by a quick text message, it's very, very difficult to get the information that you need in order to give the clients the quotes.
And so, Jason, do you think you're coming up against maybe concerns around privacy when people are not willing to talk on the phone, or is there something else? Is it a comfort level? What do you think's happening there?
Well, I find that usually it's the younger clients that are contacting me. Mm-hmm. I do custom and run custom kitchen stuff. So most of the time, they just find telephone conversations inconvenient. So
Right.
they want information, and they want it right now. They send me text messages like, I have a kitchen. How much is a custom kitchen? Well, there's a bunch of information that I need to know.
Absolutely.
And they're like, well, my kitchen is 10 feet by 8 feet. How much is it?
Right.
Well, how many corners? Do you have a sink? Do you have? And so it's much, instead of having this, I could go back and forth in text messages for 3 weeks.
Right.
Before getting the information that I need to be able to give them a quote.
Right.
So I just find in their minds, they find that the telephone conversation might be just too inconvenient for their busy schedule. So they don't want to give up their phone number, or they don't want to actually call me. Like, I give out my phone number to everybody.
Right.
Call me. So much easier.
Okay, Jason, thanks for the call. So there you go. Jason's business would be run more efficiently if people would just
Sure.
talk
So
on
a
the
couple
phone.
of ideas for you there, Jason. One is, because people need to schedule calls, as I mentioned, is to say, I can give you a very accurate price if we have a brief conversation. It's important to let them know that it's not going to take an hour, because that's what they're afraid of, that it's going to be half an hour or an hour. So I can give you a very accurate quote if we have a brief conversation. When is the best time to call you?
Okay. Well, speaking of time,
Yes.
we are almost out of it
We
here.
are.
So no more phone calls for us today. I'm sorry, folks. More people in the line there trying to get on. We'll have to continue this conversation down the road,
I
perhaps.
would love to do that. Thanks so much for today.
Thanks for
Appreciate
coming
it.
in.
Thank you.
Mary Jane Copps was our guest today, an author and facilitator who goes by the moniker The Phone Lady. Well, that is the show for today. Thanks very much for listening. We are back tomorrow, and our automotive expert, Doug Bethune, who actually gave us a phone call earlier this week on an unrelated phone-in topic.